record. Here we go. So this week's Parsha is Parshat Terumah. And we begin in this week's Parsha to outline with so much detail the dwelling place, the Mishkan, that the Jewish people will build in the desert for Hashem. So there are quite a few parshas in the Torah that are dedicated to the building of the Mishkan. So it was a very important part of our experience and has a lot of relevance to us in today's day and age, even though we don't have a physical Mishkan in the way that they built it when they were in the desert. So from this week's Parsha, Parshat Terumah, through the end of the book of Shemos, we're going to be reading lots and lots and lots about all the details and what was all about the actual work, pulling together all the material, sourcing the material, building the parts, the space, what it was made out of. This is all very important and very relevant. And it goes, I think, without saying, but clearly the Mishkan, this temporary structure that was built in the desert to house, a portable dwelling place for Hashem in the desert, is a metaphor for the home and the space that we make for Hashem in our life. So reading about the Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan and the construction of the Mishkan is very, very relevant to us. And that's why what I want to do today is focus on a small detail, on one item used in the construction of the Mishkan. And you could see how much wisdom we learn from just one minor detail. So one of the most important materials in the building of the Mishkan discussed in this week's Parsha was cedar wood. Cedar wood. Most of the structure, and many of the vessels of the Mishkan were made from wood, from cedar wood. In Hebrew, it's called Atei Shittim. So that's what I want to just focus today on Atei Shittim, on the cedar wood, and just to explore the codes and the lessons and the tools that we learn from the messages in this specific building material that we can use in creating our own mini sanctuary for Hashem. So Rashi stops on the verse when cedar wood is first mentioned in this parsha, and Rashi explains how we had cedar wood in the middle of the Sinai desert. Okay, imagine we're in a place barren of any vegetation, crop, right? No trees. So Rashi quotes the Medrash, and the Medrash says that how did the children of Israel obtain the cedar wood for the construction of the Mishkan? And Rashi quotes Rabbi Tanchuma. Rabbi Tanchuma explains that our forefather Yaakov, and forefather Jacob, foresaw with his vision that the Jewish people would build a sanctuary for Hashem in the desert. So when Yaakov moved down to Egypt 200 years earlier, he brought cedars to Egypt and planted them there. And he instructed his children that they should take them along when they left Egypt. So imagine, Zalma, bring the fire truck into the living room bed, okay? We have a fire truck here. So this is the way Rashi explains how we got cedar in the middle of the desert, right? Yaakov, 200 years before our present time, as he was moving down to the land of Egypt. This is when he reunited with his son Yosef. He already had a vision that the Jewish people would need cedar trees, so he brought them with, and he planted them in Egypt, and he told his children to take them along when they left. So the Rebbe asks a very simple question, and this is a question the Rebbe addressed on Shabbos of this week's Parsha in 1987. The Rebbe asked a very simple question. Surely there's no shortage of wood in Egypt, right? Egypt at the time was a huge empire, a very wealthy empire. I'm sure that there was wood in Egypt, and if not, it could always have been obtained for a good price, right? If the Jewish people really needed wood, Yaakov really had to bring cedar trees and plant them in Egypt, like thinking so far ahead in advance, right? And even the Sinai desert was not far from populated areas where the Jewish people could obtain wood, cedar wood. So the Rebbe asks, like, what really was the intention here of Yaakov that is so important for him? Plant cedar trees in Egypt. Think of it, 200 years before, right? Almost like prepare his children for the time, right? And the Rebbe says, Yaakov at this age was 130 years old. He was relocating his entire life, his family, his livestock, his wealth, and he's relocating to Egypt. It's not like Yaakov came to Egypt empty-handed. He came with quite an entourage. So imagine the last thing Yaakov needed to add to his luggage, was cedar trees. And this is the question the Rebbe addressed. So those who were at this Farbringen in 1987 remember that this was a very moving and emotional Farbringen. And the Rebbe addressed this question and then brings a beautiful answer. So I want to bring the Rebbe's answer, and I also have other perspectives and other messages that we will learn from these cedar trees. So the Rebbe first and foremost gives us a basic premise that Rashi is usually very, very concise. And Rashi usually just quotes his answers in the most precise language. Rashi rarely quotes the author of the teaching from the Talmud or the Medrash that he quotes from in his commentary. So here in this Rashi is one of the exceptions where Rashi actually brings the name of the rabbi who transmitted this teaching, who transmitted this Medrash where these cedar trees came from. What was the name of this rabbi? His name was Rabbi Tanchuma. In Hebrew, for those of you who are familiar with a little bit of Hebrew, Tanchuma means comfort. It comes from the word nechama or menachem or menucha, right? Comfort, consolation. There's something very, very significant here that we learn. The fact that Rashi quotes Rabbi Tanchuma's name explains why Yaakov engaged in this seemingly unnecessary toil 2 centuries before his descendants would need the cedar trees. What did Yaakov know? Yaakov, our forefather, knew that one day the very country which had been so hospitable to him and his family, the country that was saved by his son Yosef, the country that provided food and shelter to not only him, but to the entire world during the famine that everyone experienced, this same country would turn their back on the Jewish people and turn their lives upside down. And Yaakov knew that the children of Israel, that his children, his descendants, would need something to hold on to, something tangible to remind them that they don't belong here, that they will one day leave this horrible gullus, that they're going to one day leave this horrible exile, and one day they will return home. Yaakov knew that his children needed a promise. Yes, a promise. But a verbal promise was not enough. Yaakov gave his children a verbal promise. But people can't live on words alone. Words alone are not strong enough. Yaakov wanted to leave his children with something tangible that would comfort them and offer them some hope and relief, right? As they were plunged into this life of slavery. And here we have the cedar trees. So Yaakov transported from the land of Israel these young, beautiful saplings of cedar. And Yaakov lovingly planted them in the soil of Egypt. And he instructed his children, one day you will leave this country. You will leave this country and go back home. And when you leave this country, take these trees with you. Right? And that's what happened. Yaakov dies, Yosef died, all the siblings die, the grandchildren die. The first generation of Jews who still knew Yaakov and his children passed away. And then a new Pharaoh came on the scene and enslaved the Jewish people. And they lived through horrific circumstances. And as this was happening, these cedar trees were growing. So imagine these cedar trees in the distance, right? And he's like whispering, these cedars whispering to the Jewish people, this is not your home. Soon you're going to be free. Soon you're going to leave. And the fathers would tell the children and the mothers would tell the children, you see these cedar trees? These cedar trees bring us hope that we're not here forever. And one day we're going to get out of this horrible gullus. So these cedar trees almost stood as this like tangible and powerful symbol of hope for the Jewish people. And they were able to hold on to that. And these cedar trees were able to offer the Jews some measure of tanchuma, of comfort, consolation during their darkest moments. And reminded the Jewish people that they're not going to be slaves forever, and one day they will be free. The Rebbe continued this idea, and the Rebbe took this one step further. And the Rebbe said, we see in Tehillim, in the book of Psalms, that King David HaMelech, refers to the tzaddikim, or our Rebbes, our spiritual giants, as cedar trees. There's a verse in Tehillim, I would quote it if I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, but the verse in Tehillim reads that the righteous, the tzaddik, will flourish like a palm tree, grow tall like a cedar. Yaakov planted cedars in Egypt, and Hashem plants exactly such cedars in our midst, that's right, exactly, Psalm 92, that's right, Anita. Hashem plants these cedars, tzaddikim, rebbes, spiritual giants, throughout our long history to provide us also with hope for the future, right? Because a tzaddik is a neshama that's not like you and me. A tzaddik is a neshama that towers above the exile. It's like the tzaddik is rooted already in freedom, in ultimate redemption. So the tzaddik's 2 feet stand on earth, but the tzaddik's head touches the heavens. Like there's something about being connected to a tzaddik when our pain and our suffering seem to overwhelm us so much. then we look to the cedars implanted in our midst. And we turn to the cedars, we turn to our tzaddikim, our rabbis, our teachers, our guides, our rabbis and rebbitzins, and we find hope, and we find comfort, and we find encouragement and guidance, and we remember who we are and what we are capable of becoming, and we know that we're not here forever. And this, the Rebbe said in his address in 1987, this is the function of a Rebbe. Every leader among our people. The Rebbe is a Jew that reminds us that we must never despair. We should never feel like we need to surrender our life to the pain and to the suffering that we're going through. But the Rebbe reminds us that we have a godly mission. We are ambassadors of light and love and hope, and we will get out of this temporary space that we're in. This temporary space of pain, of suffering, of galus is only temporary stop in our journey towards Mashiach. I want to develop this idea a bit more because there's so many elements to this idea. The idea of the cedar trees being such a message of hope for us in our life, right? Think about what it took to build the Mishkan. The Mishkan, building the Mishkan was an enormously challenging undertaking, right? Not only because of the labor involved and the finance involved, but the desert was not the optimal place to build Hashem's dream home. A desert is dry, a desert is lifeless and barren and sandy and dirty, right? So a desert seems like the least conducive place to build a home for Hashem, to build a spiritual oasis. And Yaakov knew this. And Yaakov knew that his children would need a jump start. We need a jump start, a spiritual jump start for this mission. And that's why he planted cedar trees. The wood that they used to build the structure of the Mishkan would be from outside of the desert, would be from outside of Egypt. Where would the wood be sourced from? Sourced from Hashem's most treasured land, from the holiest environment, from the holiest country possible, from the land of Israel. So these trees, this wood, would not be at all affected from the Egyptian energy or from the energy of the Sinai desert, right? These trees, this wood was pristine. It came from Israel. It had this beautiful pulse, right? So with the cedar trees at the Mishkan's core, even the lifeless desert, even a barren desert, can be infused with the vitality needed to build a home for Hashem, right? And I think about what this means for us in our life. You know, sometimes when we're in the thick of a challenge, when we're in the thick of a painful situation, we can't see past our nose, can't even see another way out. And that's when sometimes asking, reaching out to a wise friend or reaching out to somebody outside of your immediate circle can help you get a fresh take on a tough situation, right? So yes, as intelligent as we may be and as capable as we may be, sometimes what we need is a refreshing, objective opinion. An opinion that comes from somewhere outside of ourselves, some were pristine, some were untainted, something objective, like Yaakov's cedar trees that came from the land of Israel, right? Sometimes we turn to somebody else for help, for guidance, and these people's insight can be for us very transformative and very, very useful, and help us get out of our own little bubble, right? And if we connect this back to the words of David HaMelech, right? If cedar trees are compared to tzaddikim, right? To our righteous, to our uplifting people, just like cedar trees are impressively tall, our holy tzaddikim stand above our nation, and they set a standard of excellence and sensitivity, right? Because the tzaddik is not caught up in our narishkeiten. Tzaddik is not caught up with materialism, the mundane or day-to-day struggle. Tzaddik is in a different space, a different headspace. And so by turning to a tzaddik at a time of hardship, it's almost like we tap into a whole different dynamic. We tap into a space, support, a perspective that's totally transformative because it's coming from another place. And this is the gift that is a tzaddik and a rebbe. And we are, I think, in our generation, gifted that we have, not in the way that we wish to, in the very physical sense, but we have a connection to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Every one of you, the fact that you're on this class and the fact that you're connected to Chabad, in whichever way, means that you have a connection to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is that cedar, that cedar for us, right? The Rebbe sometimes needs to help us, give us perspective, get us out of the mud, and give us that feeling of hope. I want to take the last 5 minutes of the class to mention one more idea, with your permission. And I think this is also an idea that I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, because in so many places in Hasidus, when the cedar wood is mentioned, this is the idea associated with it, and I have to mention it, or else I would probably be in trouble. So we explained where the cedar came from and why that's so significant, and the role a tzaddik plays in our life, and the hope that a tzaddik gives, and the objectivity a tzaddik gives us. I want to touch on another idea that relates to the atzei shittim, to the cedar planks of wood. And this idea is so rooted in Hasidus. It's actually one of the concepts the Rebbe spoke about in his famous Hasidic mimer of Basi Lagani that we actually discussed. The Rebbe's address, the Rebbe's formal address that he made when he accepted the leadership of world Jewry. So the Rebbe explains the Torah calls the cedar trees atzei shittim, and we want to, for a moment, just translate what these words mean. Atzei means wood. Shittim means foolish. Foolish. So if you were to translate cedar planks in English, actually it translates as foolish wood. So Chassidus asks, what's going on here? Like, why is this wood called such a fundamental part of the construction of the Mishkan? Why is it called foolish? Shtusim, right? What kind of shtus are we talking about? So there are two types of shtus. There's the not great type of shtus, right? The not great type of foolishness that sometimes leads us to make mistakes or to veer off of the path, right? Actually, it says this, our sages teach us that the only reason a person sins is because a spirit of shtus, a spirit of foolishness enters in him. And that's what causes a person to act out of like sheer insanity, right? Every Jew wants to be close to Hashem. So what foolish person would veer off and disconnect himself from Hashem? It must be that a foolish idea came into his head. But the Rebbe says that because Atzei Shittim were such a significant part of the construction of the Mishkan, there is something we can learn from Atzei Shittim. There is also a good shtus. There's also a good type of foolishness, right? And what does the Rebbe mean by that? And I think this is a very, very interesting idea to mention. When we think sometimes of foolishness, we think of like impulsivity, right? Or you lose your self-control, you lose yourself. We look at it almost like a weakness. But the Rebbe says that in our generation, we need to use shtus kedusha. We need holy foolishness. What does that mean? That means letting go a little bit. Letting go a little bit of ourselves, letting go with a joyful abandon, acting a little bit unrestrained, acting a little bit without thinking too deeply, without analyzing too much. Just let loose. That's the way we connect to Hashem best in our generation. Sometimes overthinking things too much, getting overly analytical, using our brains too much, sometimes can be a shtus. It can be not a positive thing. And the Rebbe says in our generation, we need to connect to shtus to kedusha, which means take some leaps. Start practicing, like the Rebbe says, holy folly, holy foolishness, right? Transcend your own logic, transcend your own thinking. Put your trust in Hashem. Things will work out. You can do crazy things. You can, because if you leave it up to Hashem, and you will be able to achieve things that are beyond your imagination, that are completely like beyond anything you ever imagine yourself to do. This is the ability we get from the Atzei Shittim, that we have this ability to tap into like the uninhibited, like the silliness maybe that we dismissed during our childhood, right? That pure joy, that letting loose, that getting out of your box, removing yourself, becoming just giving up all that restraint and that stress, putting that in Hashem's hands. That is the power of the Atzei Shittim. And every Jew has a Mishkan in their heart. And we're also working together globally, universally, to bring Mashiach. We could have the Beis Hamikdash again in Jerusalem, built from Atzei Shittim. How will the Mishkan be built? It will be built from not the shtus not the foolishness of the mistakes that we do, but the good shtus. The Rebbe says that our Mishkan will be built with our good shtus. I wanted to just leave off with that idea, and I hope that you gleaned enough of good messages from the Atzei Shittim